to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. It was reported in the paper this morning that there were 47,000 new cases of COVID-19 on July 4th. And that in the last 14 days, the number of people infected has gone up by 85%. We add that to all of the other stresses in our lives. We add that to the kind of messages that came from Mount Rushmore this weekend. When we look at the way in which we are divided into people who wear masks and people who refuse in the name of independence, we see a land of brokenness. To me, the importance of Jesus' promise in the gospel takes on new meaning today. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When I think of that promise, when I think of what Jesus is saying, I think of the concept of resilience. Psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. It's not just about bouncing back from difficult situations, but the sense of profound personal growth that can develop from them. Psychologists would say that resilience involves behavior, thoughts, and actions that anyone can learn and develop. And there are a number of key aspects to resilience. The prioritizing of relationships. We see it at the end of the Old Testament lesson, with Rebekah being a source of consolation after the death of Isaac's mother. We see it in the beginning of this gospel lesson of Jesus being accused of being a drunkard, of being a friend of tax collectors and sinners, of gathering people that many would not approve of. When we're part of a community, when we value our relationships, we aren't alone in our struggle. And we can develop creative solutions to our problems. The time we spend together on Sunday mornings and the time when we break up in small groups afterwards to check in with one another is such a key part of those relationships, of developing new relationships in new ways. I remember in one of the small groups, one of my friends said, I have learned about people in newer and deeper ways since we've gathered in this way. Practicing mindfulness is again raised up. And we see that in the example of Jesus, of learning from him as he goes off by himself to pray, as he goes off to center himself before going back into the ministry, surrounded by so many individuals, looking for help, looking for hope, looking for healing from him. The helping of others is what we see in Jesus. Love God, love your neighbor. And part of that is in the living out of that loving, in helping others. And we see that so much in the parables of Jesus. I think of the Good Samaritan, of the one who helps someone along the road as the religious leaders have passed by, driven by their own fear. And we see that as an example of who a neighbor should be. When we began doing our work at Barrier-Free Living, we did a lot of work with self-help. And one of the concepts that came from the Self-Help Center, which was part of City of New York's Graduate Center, was helper therapy. The idea that when we help another, oftentimes we get more out of that helping experience than the person who is the receiver of help. I think of a young man who was in our program, who was in a wheelchair. He had been shot in the back by a gang member in Chinatown as he was attempting to stand up for his brother who had been beaten up by that gang. And he said, "I'm not going to do anything in my life until I walk again." And I was with him when his doctor said, "You will never walk again. The bullet is squarely in the middle of your spine. That's not a possibility." His family sent him to China to be cured, and he came back in the wheelchair and said, "What those American doctors did to me, the Chinese doctors couldn't fix me." But at the end of the day, we had another young man come into our program with a disability who was Chinese and who had very little English proficiency. And we asked Raymond to be his tutor. And what we saw in the life of Raymond was a complete 180 of moving from saying, "I can't do anything till I walk again," to a point where he began to engage in groups. He began to engage with other individuals. He began to look toward a future where he could work, where he could thrive. And it came out of the experience of being a helper of someone else. Oftentimes when we have the feel-good experience of helping another, it opens us up to the possibility of interdependence, of asking for help not being a shameful thing, but just part of that developing of relationships, that part of finding community, accepting help from others. Psychologists would say to be proactive. What can I do about a problem in my life? If it seems too big, too overwhelming, how do I deal with that? In my social work training, I learned to take those big problems and turn those into little problems that were bite-sized, and to begin to take those little problems one by one until an individual could address the thing which seemed so overwhelming in the past. And looking for opportunities for self-discovery is part of that resilience. People often find that they have grown in the process of struggle, that they've ended up with better relationships, that they've ended up with a greater sense of strength, even when they are feeling vulnerable. That resilience, that yoke which becomes light, is not about not having struggles, not having troubles, not having stress in our lives, but addressing it in a different way and coming out stronger on the other side. We've gone through a lot of change in the way we worship, in the way we relate, and the way in which we think about reopening and accepting the circumstances that cannot be changed, to focus on the things we can do together to create new ways of coming together, to create new ways of supporting one another, of visualizing what we want and not worrying about what we fear, of believing. We say in the Creed, "I believe in." I have a relationship with God. A relationship filled with hope and filled with love. so that as we go through these challenges in our lives, we can hopefully look at these words of assurance of Jesus and find new meaning in them. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Amen.